Cool. Wait. Yeah. Hello, I'm Rachel. Welcome to my book club. I should lean this way because I'm off center. Vampires are my special interest book club. You're in the book club now and you can never leave. Congratulations and thank you for joining. I like to think that our normal is when we read collections of short stories, but I've also spent a lot of time just doing whatever I want. The premise is we read vampire short stories once a week here on Sundays, but we are currently between books, and I was supposed to get to ranking the last book that we read, but I never actually got around to it. I was actually working on another video for this channel, like one of the long form non-live ones. What do you call them? Do people have a classifying word for the videos that aren't lives besides the videos that aren't lives? I've been putting a lot of thought and work into it because I want it out by March. But it kind of took over, and then I never actually got around to flipping through the stories because I need a refresher myself on what they're about. And I like to find little moments in the story to highlight that I enjoyed, so that I don't just have a whole bunch of complaints about a story, you know? I'm going into too much detail. We are currently between books. I did not get to do what I wanted to do, and I didn't really want to go back to what we have been doing, which is reading another encyclopedia. I just want to try something new and interesting in this moment when I don't really have anything planned, last second thrown together. But when we were reading the encyclopedia, there was an entry about Transylvanian Society of Dracula. And when you try to look into that, it's a whole bunch of mumbo jumbo that I am much too tired to process and go through. But I was wanting to, when we read the article, I did actually want to dig into it deeper. And one thing that popped up when I did was the Journal of Dracula Studies, which is an international thing. There's chapters of the Transylvanian Society of Dracula throughout the world, and they publish their own journals of Dracula studies. And one that popped up immediately was Journal of Dracula Studies. Hold on. What do I want to open? You know what? I want to open, I wanted to read some of the journals of Dracula studies, just for fun, just to see, because we've read journals here before. We were reading Slayage, which is a journal specifically for Buffy the Vampire Slayer that was being printed when Buffy the Vampire Slayer was on air, which I thought was really interesting. And I thought, instead of going back to that and potentially boring everybody, we could try a new thing, the Journal of Dracula Studies. And luckily, the PDFs are just online, ready to download and to read. So why not read a couple today? You know, I think it's important to think of not just vampires, but stories in general outside of just the fictional stories that we've read. It's really important to critically think and to analyze the things that you're reading. So, it's fun to just, consume, but it's also fun to poke at the things you're consuming and, figuring out how it was constructed from, a up-down kind of, I am the puppet master, as well as from the point of view of the puppets. Stories can tell you a lot without really trying. Why are the curtains blue is such an interesting concept and such an interesting thing for me to think about. I am not one of those people who say, who cares if the curtains are blue? I'm saying, I don't know why the curtains are blue, but I want to read your book on why they are. And then I want to giggle and kick my feet and pick up another one by somebody else. I'm rambling. If that's what you like, hell yeah. I would love to talk somebody else into viewing stories this way too. If you're with me, that's awesome. Let's do that tonight. Again, I kind of cobbled this together last second because what I intended to do and never got around to, so everything's kind of let me open it. It's not really set up. Let's see. I don't need you to see the YouTube page. Okay. Window capture. Journal of Dracula Studies. This is from 2019. Desire of Many Things. An Augustine Matrix of Bram Stoker's The Censorship of Fiction. I have no idea what that means. Written by Geoffrey Ryder. Cover page footnote. Geoffrey Ryder is professor and coordinator of literature in Lancaster Bible College and an associate editor at the website Christ and Pop Culture. He holds an MA in church history from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and a PhD in English from Baylor University. In addition to work on Bram Stoker, Ryder has also published articles on such writers as George MacDonald and Arthur Machen. Interesting. Desire of Many Things. The Augustine Matrix of Bram Stoker's The Censorship of Fiction, Geoffrey Ryder. And it just says what it already says. Okay. Though he is best known today as the author of the wildly popular horror novel Dracula, Bram Stoker, am I the only one who has always read his name as like Bam Stoker? Like, it's always been Stroker, and like my brain hates that there's no R in his name. It always wants to move it around. Bram Stoker is such a weird name. Bram Stroker is better? I don't know. Whatever. He was many things in his lifetime: law clerk, stage manager, athlete, and on the side, a writer. He published novels sporadically, most especially in the few spare moments he had away from his busy job as the state manager of London's Lyceum Theatre, home of the best-known Shakespearean actor in England at the time, Henry Irving. We read a short story about that guy. In the period between Irving's death in 1906 and Stoker's own passing in 1912, Stoker began to increase his output of nonfiction in journalism. Perhaps his most infamous essay from this period is... I actually don't know what my screen looks like. I should have checked that out. I need to make the text a little bit bigger so it's easier for me to... No, yeah. Okay, making that smaller made it bigger. That was good. In the period between Irving's death in 1906 and Stoker's own passing in 1912, Stoker began to increase his output of nonfiction in journalism. Perhaps his most infamous essay from this period is a short work entitled simply The Censorship of Fiction, in which he suggested that the state should be responsible for censoring works with lewd sexual content. Since its publication in 1908, this essay has been largely ignored, except by Stoker scholars, many of whom take some delight in pointing out the supposed ironies that the author of Dracula should pen such a work. Whether or not one accepts Stoker's thesis, however, the essay deserves further attention from Stoker scholarship as a substantive description of his conscious artistic motivations. One aspect of its premise and conclusions that is worth noting is the way in which the censorship of fiction operates in ways that parallel the thought of St. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential thinkers in all church history. Whether or not Stoker was directly and consciously invoking Augustine, there are enough correspondences between their writings to suggest, at the very least, that the censorship of fiction is embedded in a philosophical matrix composed in part of Augustine's ideas. Contemporary readers of Bram Stoker might not think to associate him with St. Augustine, but there is good reason for believing he would have been exposed to the Church Fathers' work during the course of his lifetime. While Augustine's work has had immense influence on Western civilization as a whole, the 19th century in particular saw a renewed interest in the patristic era of church history. Patristic. The Oxford movement, with its Roman Catholic leanings, sought a return to the church traditions of the early centuries, and Victorian historians were less interested than historians of the 18th century in polemical historiography that reads those years as the Dark Ages. The historical novel was becoming fashionable, and this trend led to fictional representations of the early church. John Henry Newman depicted 3rd century Christianity in his novel Callista, which was itself a rejoinder to Charles Kingsley's account of the 5th century Hypatia. Interesting that this author of this article is like a church dude, and of course he's going on about church stuff. Good lord. Kingsley was more critical of the patristic church, vehemently opposing what he saw as an effeminate move toward early Christian aestheticism. I don't know how to say that. And away from Protestant and doggedly heterosexual muscular Christianity. But Kingsley and his other theologically progressive friends like F.D. Maurice and George MacDonald also jumped back to the early church in their admiration for Origen, in whom they found a kindred spirit in their own Christian universalism. The liberal theologian and scholar, thank you for being here to suffer with this with me. God. The liberal theologian and scholar Edwin Abbott, best known for his fantasy novel Flatlands, penned 3 books set in the 1st century: Philochristius, Onesimus, and Silanus, while the decadent art critic Walter Pater added his own Marius the Epicurean. These were just a few prominent examples of a massive subgenre. Indeed, Royal W. Rhodes, who has done the most substantial study of such fiction, must confess that, quote, the mere listing of those early church novels is an arduous task, unquote. Nor was the interest in the church fathers limited to prose fiction. In the realm of poetry, the future Archbishop Richard Chenevix Trench penned a lengthy verse entitled The Story of Justin Martyr, while the Anglican priest John Mason Neale was exploring the Eastern Orthodox side of the tradition, busily translating ancient Christian hymns, many of which remain in hymnals today. Beyond a generic interest in patristics, literary critics have identified specifically Augustine strands winding through many of the best-known writers of the Victorian age. Howard Fulwiler has noted a strain of Augustine Platonism in many of Tennyson's works. According to Joseph Baker, Thackeray's Vanity Fair illustrates principles from Augustine's City of God. I want to interrupt to say I liked the Vanity Fair movie. See, I just want to feel like I'm smart, okay? I can admit that I watched the Reese Witherspoon Vanity Fair movie, and it made me want to read the novel, but the novel was so long, I did not get very far in it. I'm smart too, see? James Finn Cotter has twice remarked on the heavy influence of Augustine upon the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins. Mary Lou Hill sees in the Eucharistic theology of Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market evidence of the Confessions, particularly the popular translation done by Tractarian E.B. Pusey, which has made the text available to those unable to read Latin. John Henry Newman's spiritual autobiography, Apologia Pro Vita Sua, also clearly bears the imprint of Augustine's Confessions. Birch Pranger even finds evidence of the Confessions in the work of Henry James. Whether or not Bram Stoker has read Augustine thoroughly, then, the Bishop of Hippo's overall penetration into Victorian intellectual culture meant that Stoker must have had at least a passing familiarity. but there is good evidence for supporting that he very may well have read Augustine at some point, particularly during his college years. Stoker attended Trinity College, Dublin from 1864 to 1870, and it is highly likely he would have been exposed to Augustine's work at that time. The Church of Ireland was disestablished in 1869, meaning that TCD was still officially Protestant throughout most of Stoker's time there, but Augustine was always popular even with Protestant thinkers. Faculty and graduates of the college often cite him in their published works. Stoker's tutor at Trinity, Dr. George Ferdinand Shaw, was theologically on the more ecumenical side of the spectrum, but also considered religious education to be a vital branch of knowledge. Thus Shaw, who had taught ethics and logic and who appreciated Greek and Latin classes, may have discussed Augustine with his young protege. Trinity historians R.B. McDowell and D.A. Webb also observed that students living on or around campus had to attend catechetical lectures on the Bible and the creeds, a requirement that only became optional in 1904. Murray notes while Stoker's later attendance at TCD seems to have fluctuated due to his job situation, he was a fairly consistent early on, meaning he would have attended such training. Moreover, though he did not distinguish himself for his academic work while at Trinity, Stoker was an active member of both the College Philosophical Society and the College Historical Society. Indeed, during his time at TCD, Stoker would have the opportunity to preside over each, serving as president of the Phil in 1867 and auditor of the Hist in 1872. These organizations included many of Dublin's future intellectual and artistic leaders. There is no doubt that Stoker and his associates at Trinity tended toward the eccentric and the liberal end of the spectrum. Nonetheless, given Stoker's associations with the Phil and the Hist, coupled with the avowedly religious background of Trinity College Dublin at the time, one would expect him to come away with some knowledge of Augustine's philosophy. Nor should we be surprised to find evidence of a patristic philosopher in the writings of an author frequently associated with darkness and horror. Anyone who knows Bram Stoker by more than just his reputation will affirm without hesitation his substantial use of Christian language, themes, and imagery. While this usage may be glossed over at times by critics more interested in contemporary literary theories, few would deny their presence. As Stoker biographer Paul Murray maintains, the world which produced Stoker cannot be divorced from its religious preoccupations, and yet their significance passes many commentators by. There are indeed attempts to substitute the secular concerns of our own time, the various isms, for the obvious reality of Stoker's convictions. Oops, that was a quote. My bad. Many of the tales in Stoker's collection Under the Sunset, for example, are simply fantasized versions of biblical stories. They are, in the words of Stoker critic William Hughes, quote, implicated in and informed by an identifiably Christian discourse, unquote. In the short story The Judge's House, the protagonist is haunted by a supernaturally malevolent rat, and only his family Bible has any power to protect him. Christianity is perhaps most prevalent in Stoker's best-known novel, Dracula. Indeed, Christopher Herbert makes the fully justifiable claim that, quote, critical study of Dracula needs to begin by recognizing it as very likely the most religiously saturated popular novel of its time, unquote. Clive Leatherdale is even more explicit, suggesting, quote, that one of the basic lessons of the novel was to reaffirm the existence of God in an age when the weakening hold of Christianity generated fresh debate about what lay beyond death, unquote. In other words, Stoker's argument in The Censorship of Fiction may not be so incongruous with his fictional practice as it may initially seem. He begins his essay by asserting the vital and largely positive role he sees fiction playing in contemporary society. At its best, Stoker believes fiction can flourish and prove beneficial when authors consciously restrain themselves from giving their imagination license in writing about harmful topics. He acknowledges that it may be impossible for anyone to prevent fully the imagination from straying into unhealthy realms, but an individual need not put his or her basest desires into written form and thereby risk corrupting the minds of others. While Stoker does not condone the audience is willing to pay money for such corrosive writing, his sternest condemnation is reserved for those without the self-restraint or reticence. I think I added an extra T. Reticence to rein in their sinful desires, authors who abuse their powers for motives of pure profit. Stoker is quick to reassert that there is nothing intrinsically evil about using fiction to instill moral truth, and he cites Jesus' use of parables as a prime example. But in egregious cases, when unrestrained writers continue to write and unethical publishers continue to publish and undiscriminating audiences continue to buy, he maintains that the state should step in and censor such products. Quote, truth can always investigate in a worthy fashion, unquote, he concludes, but, quote, those who prostitute their talents, and amongst them the fairest imagination, must expect the treatment accorded to the class which they have deliberately joined, unquote. Okay. Stoker refuses to give specific examples of the class of writing to which he is opposed, maintaining, quote, it is not well to name either these books or their authors, for such would but make known what is better suppressed, and give the writers the advertisements which they crave, unquote. Scholars analyzing the essay since its first publication have assumed its target is specifically pornographic fiction. Stoker biographer Barbara Belfer reports that one newspaper of the day ran the headline, quote, prurient novel is condemned, Bram Stoker opens crusade in London, unquote. Maurice Hindle likewise reads the essay as an attack on pornography and joins with Belford in singling out the publisher Charles Carrington as likely the particular target of Stoker's ire. Under the Obscene Publications Act of 1857, purveyors of such material could face criminal charges in England. However, Carrington and others evaded this sanction by centering their publishing operations on the continent. Groups like the National Vigilance Association, a successor to the earlier Society for the Suppression of Vice, did their best to aid British authorities in tracking down such offenders, but as Donald Thomas has observed, officials across the Channel, quote, were not always as obliging to their English colleagues as they might have been, principally because they were not much concerned with postal or other traffic in books from France to England. It was for the English customs or postal authorities to deal with that. There was hardly more than a token cooperation in serving expulsion orders on Carrington in 1901 and 1907, unquote. Thomas points out that 1907 saw another case as well in which French police failed to assist their Scotland Yard counterparts. The timing may be significant. The censorship of fiction had its genesis as a pair of addresses, one to London's White Friars Club in October 1907, and then another to the Authors Club a month later. Despite his reluctance to name the offenders outright in the published version of the essay, Stoker's White Friars speech was apparently teeming with references to objectionable fiction, which was a quote, my bad. Moreover, notwithstanding the essay's indirectness, there is certainly no shortage of textual evidence to indicate that pornography is the target of Stoker's ire. He explicitly indicts fiction in which, quote, evil effects, unquote, are, quote, produced on the senses, unquote. In particular, however, he believes that, quote, the only emotions which in the long run harm are those arising from sex impulses, and when we have realized this, we have put a finger on the actual danger, unquote. In designating sexual desire as a locus of harm, Stoker tracks closely with Augustine's analysis of sexual lust in City of God. Like Stoker, Augustine sees sexual sin as in a category wholly its own, since it is a physical desire capable of acting independently of the rational will. In City of God, Augustine writes, quote, this lust assumes power not only over the whole body, And not only from the outside, but also internally, it disturbs the whole man. When the mental emotion combines and mingles with the physical craving, resulting in a pleasure surpassing all physical delights. So intense is the pleasure that when it reaches its climax, there is an almost total extinction of mental alertness. The intellectual senses, as it were, are overwhelmed, unquote. In the Confessions, Augustine is similarly troubled by his physical lusts, recalling how, in his youth, he could not will himself to want to give up sexual sin. He famously tells God, quote, I had prayed to you for chastity, and said, give me chastity and continence, but not yet. For I was afraid that you would answer my prayer at once and cure me too soon of the disease of lust, which I wanted satisfied, not quelled, unquote. Stoker deals harshly with the purveyors of pornographic work because they provide ordinary people the opportunity to indulge imaginatively sexual lusts which, as Augustine was well aware, are often so powerful as to overcome the rational and moral faculties of the human will. This does not mean that either Augustine or Stoker is opposed to human sexuality. Indeed, both writers consider it a natural good. Influenced by the environment of late antiquity, Augustine at times may go too far in condemning non-procreative sex. Even so, despite his reputation as something of a prude, Augustine actually fought hard against Manichaean teachings that sex was intrinsically evil. Indeed, in City of God, Augustine argues, rather progressively for his day, that Adam and Eve would have reproduced through sexual means even had they not fallen. Quote, if anyone says that there would have been no intercourse or procreation if the first human beings had not sinned, he is asserting, in effect, that man's sin was necessary to complete the number of the saints. It follows that, if there had been no sin, marriage would have been worthy of the happiness of paradise, and would have given birth to children to be loved, and yet would not have given rise to any less to be ashamed of. Why should we not believe that the sexual organs could have been the obedient servants of mankind at the bidding of the will, unquote. For Augustine's ideal unfallen condition, human sexuality is good because it originally would have been under the control of the will, as with other bodily functions. As Donald H. Burt contends, Augustine's conclusion is that sexuality, like every other human drive, is good in itself and does not necessarily constitute an obstacle to the friendship that is the foundation of the family. Indeed, it can contribute warmth and energy to the oneness of heart that friendship demands. Which was a quote, my bad. Similarly, Stoker takes no issue with sexuality per se. He does decry the wantonness of 18th century writers like Smollett and Fielding, as well as the drama of the Restoration. Yet the novels to which he objects are far more damaging than the coarseness of pre-19th century writing. Stoker's own fiction frequently explores the dynamics of both appropriate and inappropriate, marital and extramarital sexuality. And Dracula, the wanton sexuality of Dracula's brides, and the undead Lucy Westenra is contrasted with the implicit conjugal sexuality of Jonathan and Mina Harker, out of which is born their son Quincy by the novel's end. Stoker's novel Lady Antheline, published the same year as The Censorship of Fiction, is, as Carol Senf maintains, quote, a celebration of sexuality, unquote. Indeed, as David Glover points out, quote, Stoker is concerned to celebrate carnal passion, unquote. In the novel, going well beyond Augustine is his approbation of mutual attraction in the senses. Moreover, in Lady Antheline, this attraction is specifically united to Eden, indicating that Stoker, like Augustine, considers sexuality a prelapsarian good, as in this passage, worth quoting at length, O God. Quote, Antheline, seeing and hearing, thrilled through to the very marrow of his bones. His great love compelled him. He made no movement toward her, but looked with eyes of rapture. Such a moment was beyond personal satisfaction. It was of the gods, not of men. And so they stood. Then the tears welled over in Joy's eyes beneath the fallen lids. They hung on the dark, curly lashes and rolled like silver beads down the softness of her cheeks. Still, Atheline made no sign. He felt that the time had not yet come. The woman was his own now. He felt instinctively, as it was it was his duty, his sacred privilege to protect her. Unthinkingly, he moved a step back on the road he had come. Instinctively, Joy did the same. It was without thought or intention on the part of either, all instinctive, all natural. The usage of the primeval squaw to follow her master outlives races. Then he paused. She came up to him, and they walked level. Not another word had been spoken, but there are silences that speak more than can be written in ponderous tomes. These two, this man and this woman, knew. They had in their hearts, in those glorious moments, all the wisdom won by joy and suffering through all the countless ages since the Lord rested on that first Sabbath eve and felt his work was finished." Unquote. What is distinctive in this passage is the explicit link between the character's natural physical attraction and God-ordained goodness of creation. Stoker would hardly have been so foolish as to publish such a novel as this at the same time as his essay if he thought there was any intrinsic contradiction between fictional discussion of human sexuality and his crusade against pornography. The essay itself actually makes this carefully delineated distinction. Quote, "Writers who deal with lewd subjects," unquote, he points out, "do so," quote, "in order that they may deal with what they call problems," unquote. But Stoker sees this purely as a thinly veiled subterfuge. Such novels, he feels, quote, "use the word problem either as a shelter for themselves or as a blind for some intention more base than mere honest investigation," unquote. It is this mere, quote, mere honest investigation," unquote, that Stoker would be conducting in his own novels. Truth, he maintains, quote, "can always investigate in a worthy fashion," unquote. Because Stoker believes, like Augustine, that sexuality is naturally good, it is fair game to be explored in a fictional context, provided the intent is honest investigation in the pursuit of truth. Even most Stoker critics concede that his novels do not consciously contradict his axiom, though many believe they may do so unconsciously. That is, if Stoker's fiction does contradict his stated position on the purposes of literature, he appears to have been quite oblivious to the effect. Even though sexuality is intrinsically good in the Augustinian mindset, it is also very open to abuse. This is because humans are sinful and fallen, and it is the nature of evil to pervert good things. This view is often articulated by Augustine in his writings and his work on free will. Augustine explicitly states what is bad is the will's turning away from the unchangeable good and its turning to changeable goods. That was also a quote. I'm not very good at keeping up with the quotes. There is nothing wrong with a sexual marital relationship, but if the focus upon God and his unchanging nature and purposes is lost, a good object used to fulfill a good desire may be skewed or perverted. Moreover, Augustine steadfastly defended against the Pelagians of the doctrine of original sin, which asserted that human wills were awry from conception, so that in the fallen world it had become natural for humans to sin. In the moments leading up to his conversion in the Confessions, Augustine laments his inability to control his will in the way he is able to control the limbs of his body. Quote, "For the rule of sin is a force of habit, by which the mind is swept along and held fast even against its will, yet deservedly because it fell into the habit of its own accord," unquote. In The Censorship of Fiction, Stoker likewise locates the desire for salacious reading in humanity's sinfulness. The availability of pornographic fiction is dangerous because it allows the authors and publishers a way to pry on the innate failings of human beings. As noted earlier, in Stoker's view, quote, "the only emotions which in the long run harm are those arising from sex impulses," unquote. But those impulses are bound to become distorted because of humanity's overall sinfulness, a theme that reoccurs throughout the essay. Stoker presupposes that a warrant, quote, "the imperfection of humanity, human weakness, the inherent evil of man," presupposes as a warrant the imperfection of humanity, human weakness, the inherent evil in man, I'm doing air quotes. Indeed, he believes that, quote, the force of evil, anti-ethical evil, is the more dangerous as it is a natural force. It is as natural for man to sin as it is to live, unquote. The distributors of objectionable material are not targeted because they are any worse than the rest of poor humanity, but because they go beyond merely passive indulgence in sins of the flesh, exploiting the weakness in others for profit. Stoker hopes that in the end, quote, public ignominy, police interference, or the reproaches of conscience, unquote, will ultimately catch up with them. Then, he believes, they will deservedly receive the consequences for indulging in such a variety of sins. Quote, it is the same old problem which has tortured fallible humanity from the beginning, or, at any rate, since desire of many things found itself face to face with inadequate powers and insufficient opportunities for attainment, unquote. While not excusing the audiences of erotic fiction, then, Stoker is especially hard on its producers, because they have abused their imagination and gifts of language purely for personal gain. In this way, he also follows along with Augustine, for whom eloquence and rhetoric were valuable gifts, but easily misused. Augustine's pre-Christian education made him keenly aware of the ways in which good language could be appropriated for less than admirable purposes. In the Confessions, he would regret his useful obsession with empty romances like Virgil's Aeneid. I have a copy of it. Nobody ever told me how to read it. I never looked it up. Have you ever been in a college course and you said the name of a character wrong and your professor looked you in the eyes and told you next time Google the names so you know how to say them? I haven't. I've never been through that embarrassment before. God. In the Confessions, he would regret his useful obsession with empty romances like Virgil's Aeneid, lamenting the fact that rather than weeping over the vanities of the world, instead I leapt for Dido, who surrendered her life to the sword. For I forsook you, God, and surrendered myself to the lowest of your created beings. God, this is so silly. And I just looked, I have 8 pages left. Oh, God. His early training and rhetoric and exposure to eloquent writers like Cicero helped him realize later in life that good phrasing alone was not the only barometer of a text's worth. Augustine also acknowledges the dangers of exploitative writing in his most extensive discussion of rhetoric on Christian teaching. Here, like Stoker, he attacks both the people who produce wicked writing and the audiences that sustain such writing. Quote, so much attention has been paid to the charms of style that not only things which should not be done, but even things which should be avoided and abhorred, evil and wicked things, eloquently advocated by evil and wicked men, are avidly read about by people without any intention of giving their consent, but simply for the sake of delight. Man, where did my chapstick go? If Augustine can be this harsh on writers, did I say unquote? Because that was a quote. If Augustine can be this harsh on writers such as Virgil, who most subsequent generations would consider classic, the Carrington-style pornography Stoker has in mind surely would fall under the aegis of, quote, evil and wicked things eloquently advocated by evil and wicked men, unquote. Man. You ever get the really good feeling that if anybody ever saw your Kindle account, they would hate you? Yet on Christian teaching also recognizes the potential value of good rhetoric to the cause of Christ, which is a major theme of the work. For Augustine, pagan learning may be turned to good purposes by those with goodly ends. In a famous passage, he compares the Christians' task to that of the Israelites at the Exodus, who brought Egyptian treasures with them on their journey. Quote, "These treasures, like the silver and gold, which they did not create but dug, as it were, from the mines of providence, which is everywhere, which were used wickedly and harmfully in the service of demons, must be removed by Christians, as they separate themselves in spirit from the wretched company of pagans, and applied to their true function, that of preaching the gospel." Unquote. Scripture itself may be said to plunder the Egyptians in the way it employs stylistic features found throughout the classical world. Quote, "The literary-minded should be aware that our Christian authors used all the figures of speech which teachers of grammar call by their Greek name of tropes, and that they did so more diversely and profusely than can be judged or imagined by those who are unfamiliar with Scripture or who gained their knowledge of figures from other literature. In the divine books, we find not only examples of these tropes, as of everything else, but also the names of some of them, like allegory, enigma, and parable." Unquote. Far from being the simplistic text the young Augustine once thought it to be, the Bible is thus actually a model of effective rhetoric. Indeed, as Robert Dodaro has observed, Augustine found it entirely reasonable to believe that God, in his communication with humanity, would employ the tropes and methods of a good orator. Orator. Quote, "This rationale for God's use of metaphors, parables, and enigmas depends upon a more fundamental concept of the orator's duties as conceived by traditional rhetorical theorists, teaching, moving or persuading, and delighting the audience with his words. Augustine holds that the entire content of the Scriptures can be interpreted through rhetorical theory." Unquote. In these respects, once again, we find the censorship of fiction covering similar ground. As with Augustine, Stoker is alert to both the perils and profits of employing good rhetoric. The authors of pornography sin not only in the production and distribution of deleterious material, but perhaps even more fundamentally in their perversion of their natural creative gift. As Maggie Kilgore asserts, art for Stoker is a quote, "Art, for Stoker, is a sacred spiritual impulse, which, in the hands of these criminals, is perverted for profit." Unquote. Okay. He acknowledges that, quote, "in imagination of whose products the best known and most potent is perhaps fiction, there is a danger of corruption." Unquote. Because of Stoker's high esteem for the role of the imagination, higher probably than Augustine's would have been, he feels keenly the betrayal that lewd writers commit. Quote, "They have found an art wholesome, they made it morbid, they found it pure, they left it sullied. Up to this time it was free, the freest thing in the land, they so treated it. They so abused the powers allowed them and their own opportunities that continued freedom becomes dangerous, even impossible." Unquote. They made it morbid. They left it sullied. Okay. Throughout the essay, Stoker frequently reiterates his regret that such an act so bluntly as censorship should be necessary. But he feels that by debasing, quote, "an art so fine as literature, with a spirit as subtle and evanescent as," I cannot even begin to pronounce that word, "something ether," unquote. "Such writers have left the state with no other choice." Okay. But Stoker is only faced with his dilemma because he is so conscious of fiction's potential virtues. Quote, "It can be most potent for good," if, quote, unquote, he is convinced, but, quote, "if we are to allow it work for evil, we shall surely have to pay in time for the consequent evil effects," unquote. To demonstrate fiction's value, Stoker, like Augustine, appeals to Scripture as the model. Fiction, he contends, has the imprimatur of no less than Jesus himself. Quote, "The highest of all teachers and moralists, Christ himself, did not disdain it as a method or opportunity of carrying great truth, but he seemed to hold it as his chosen means of seeking to instill truth. What is a parable but a novel in little?" Unquote. As Augustine praised the Bible and its divine author for its effective use of rhetoric, so too Stoker praises Christ's ability to use the fictional parable form for moral instruction, and, as with Augustine, Stoker concludes that eloquence of expression should hardly be avoided if it can be put to appropriate moral ends. Quote, "When Christ taught in such a way, are we to reprobate the method or even to forego it? Should we not rather encourage and protect so potent a form of teaching and guard it against evil use?" Unquote. It is, this is so funny. Okay, nerds. It is hardly common to read Dracula or any of Stoker's other novels as moral or even religious parables, yet the censorship of fiction suggests that is exactly how he meant them to be read, insofar as he used genres and plots not commonly associated with moral and religious instruction to gain a wider audience for his work. He was ultimately successful in his ends, but insofar as the moral or religious elements of his long parables have been subsequently ignored or misunderstood, he apparently failed. Stoker himself recognizes he meant to write this thing, but he fucking failed at it. L. F in the chat. When you try to write something, but nobody reads it that way. F in the chat. Stoker himself recognizes human imperfection in the essay and acknowledges that imagination is ultimately entirely individual. Thus, even a work designed to investigate in worthy fashion complex moral truths may ultimately be appropriated by its audience in unattended ways. Indeed, most critics now believe that the Stoker's fiction succeeds on the popular and critical levels because his moral intentions failed. Even so, if the censorship of fiction is taken seriously as an accurate representation of Stoker's thought, there can be little doubt that, at least consciously, he thought of his fiction as morally salutary. And in striving to use his own imaginative and rhetorical gifts to pursue truth as he understood it, Stoker was not alone. He was simply one in a great tradition of eloquent religious writers of whom Augustine stands out above the rest. End of fucking article. I'm gonna say something that's gonna shock everybody. It shouldn't, though. I've never read Dracula. I've watched some old movies of vampires. I've never read Dracula. I know the Dracula story because I watched like 3 Dracula movies in a row and they all had exactly the same plot. This is interesting. I cannot tell you whether I agree or not because I don't fucking know. God. But it's so funny that the ending's like, well, you know, a lot of people think that because he failed, he kind of succeeded. Jesus Christ, dude. Everybody thinks you suck. Okay. I mean, I can say that, I'm one of the dirty heathens that both writes and reads pornographic literature. And you know what? If I'm going to hell, I'm going to hell. I mean, I don't believe it exists, and I don't care to discuss it with anybody else. But if I'm going, then I'm going. And you know what? I guess that's fine. Because I'm not gonna change anything. Because I don't care. Because I think that pornographic writing is funny and fun, and I like to write it, and I like to read it. I'm a dirty heathen, and yeah. I just read 20 fucking pages. I need my water. I left it all the way over there. Everybody stay still for a second. one thing that makes me tired is the youths on Twitter complaining about pro and anti shipping, I think it's called. It's just like if you're writing really perverse, really fucked up, really weird shit that makes my eyes burst in my skull, okay. I think the question of where to put such things so that people who could be harmed by it are not harmed by it is more important than whether or not you should be writing and or reading it. Doing this with a mirror. You probably did not end up on the side. I don't know what I'm doing. Censorship is stupid. Write and read whatever you want, but if your shit shouldn't be seen by children, then make sure that they can't see it, you know? Or if you're writing shit that would really trigger somebody, don't pretend it's something that it isn't just so you get more eyeballs on the thing. You know, label it, mark it off, put it somewhere where people who can't be harmed can't see it. You know what I mean? And that's my take. We only consume what we love. I like that title already. American radio adaptation of the female vampire and Bram Stoker's Dracula and Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla by Kathryn Eccles. Kathryn Eccles is an instructional associate professor in the Department of Liberal Studies at Texas A&M at Galveston. Dr. Eccles' areas of research include medievalism, adaptation theory, Arthurian and medieval literature to Chaucer, and the adaptation of literature to the oral medium of radio broadcasts in the United States between the 1930s to mid-1950s. Is anybody else, like, low-key fascinated by, like, the radio broadcast that... I've never actually, like, went out and tried to find any or listen to them. But I've always really wanted to, especially since I got into podcasting and, you know, short story podcasting. It's always kind of fascinated me, low-key. I want to know if there are any about vampires. I could probably try to look that up right now. Should I? Should we get lost? How do you even Google that? Vampires. Yes, vampires. I should want something on my screen. Radio broadcasts. Old-time radio shows. Old-time radio catalog. Get your garlic and crucifix. This collection includes a wide variety of vampire-themed old-time radio shows. Oh, shit. Okay. Well, they exist, apparently. Temple of Vampires MP3? Oh, no. Don't go over there, you guys. That's the cult. Anyway. Tuning into a radio horror program for an hour's entertainment is for the radio listener a deliberate act that satisfies a particular need. Radio horror programs with vampires exploited narrative description, sound effects, and music to make listeners physically and emotionally react to a scene. Listeners experience dread and fear hearing, but not seeing a monster's approach, and recoil at the violence suggested in the vampire's piercing scream as the sound of a vampire killer's hammer drives a stake into its heart. Beginning in the 1930s, radio horror programs pushed boundaries in their presentation of the female vampire. Steve Dillon suggests that because listening to radio is an intimate rather than spectacular experience, quote, It is centered on voice rather than image. It still maintains a system of gendered surveillance and appraisal. Women are not just heard on the radio, they are viewed. Even if listeners cannot see them, female characters are judged by what they look like. Thus, the potentially asexual world of radio continues quite uninterruptedly. Why? The visual focus on sex and sexuality found in magazines and movies, unquote. I gotta drink more of this. I should have just poured it into a cup because I feel so silly going like, moo, on screen. Don't look at me. Yeah, one of these things are Vibe Below. I think I talked about this before. For Vibe Below, and it's got like, this is how much water you should drink during the day. But I never fill it up to the top. I just kind of fill it up halfway because it's so big and heavy. And then I just kind of hope I'm drinking enough water, which completely destroys the reason that I got it to begin with. I have no idea how much water I'm drinking in the day. Okay. A perception of the female vampire is shaped by the individual listener's experience with women and gendered stereotypes in media. Radio as an oral medium, quote, followed the same patriarchal principles as of visual assessment found in movies and magazines, unquote. As an extension of visual culture, radio perpetuated social constructs and gender stereotypes in line with American popular culture. Early silent screen stars Clara Bow and Theda Bara played to their roles as vamps and informed the image of the female vampire on and off screen. Clara Bow was a vampire? No, she wasn't. Was she? I thought she was just the it girl. Are you saying because she was like a vamp? Was she a vamp or was she just a cute it girl? What do you mean? Radio horror programs and a selection of American radio horror programs broadcast between the 1930s and 1980s feature female vampires with the same, quote, sexual veracity, unquote, ascribed to the vamp of the silver screen. Clara Bow's ambivalent dimension as a flapper akin to a vamp was, as a vamp, a step away from a literal vampire. Likewise, Theda Bara, quote, emphasized the sexual veracity of the new woman and, like Bow, operated as Dracula's female proxy. I think the quote is supposed to end somewhere in here. Unquote. The study considers the representation of the female vampire in radio adaptations of Dracula and Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla. Carmilla and the Odd Vampire Tale, broadcast between the 1930s and 1980s, are available through internet audio databases. Vampires, quote, are almost pure creations of American popular culture. Their titles and motifs lifted from European ... legend and transformed into horrific celebrities, unquote, who represent what Americans most fear and desire. While Count Dracula became a modus legend, born during an important cultural moment and a representative of Victorian societal anxieties, the female vampire, with her dangerous sexuality, threatened conservative American values. Instead of shying away from the overt sexuality or suggested lesbianisms in Le Fanu's novella, radio scriptwriters adapting Carmilla for horror anthology programs, quote, emphasize the seductive eroticism of the original, often making the lesbian elements of the novella the focus, unquote. Radio adaptations of Carmilla also emphasize the threat Carmilla the vampire had on her young female victims. Dracula's vampire bridges also are players on radio as clearly sexual in their aggressive pursuit. Did I say bridges? Wow, I am... Dracula's vampire brides also are played on radio as clearly sexual in their aggressive pursuit and seduction of their male victims. Radio listeners imagine Dracula's female counterpart as charming, sensual, sexually aggressive, and dangerous. Victims and victors alike in the episodes considered here are hypnotized by a vampire with the ability to induce passivity in both male and female prey. For instance, Jonathan Harker's seduction scene in the 1949 Stage 49 adaptation of Dracula is suggestively erotic. The listener imagines being in the room with Harker and the vampire brides. Like wolves circling their prey, growling, and the listeners imagine gnashing their teeth. The vampire women argue over who will kiss his neck. Dracula intercedes on Harker's behalf, prompting the vampire with the golden hair to accuse the Count of being ignorant of love. Love, in this instance, has a much different connotation as it is linked to the female vampire's penetration of Harker's neck to drain him of blood. The vampire's breathy, seductive, modulated tones and Harker's obvious struggle to keep her away make for an entertaining 3 minutes of radio. The female vampire of radio is predatory, bloodthirsty, and sexual. They are Dracula's Seraglio of pale beauties, slaves to his superhuman will. And as, quote, females, passive vampires in life, active ones in death, quote, unquote, who, quote, stand alone, a demonic force in her own right, unquote. Bram Stoker's Count Dracula and Todd Browning's 1931 film adaptation of the Gothic novel Dracula, with Bela Lugosi in the title role, are the standard by which to measure all other vampires in literature, on screen, stage, and on radio. Yet the female vampire ruled the ether. Surprisingly, of the two classic vampire stories brought to radio, Carmilla seems to be the most popular. Radio horror programs aired dramatizations based on original scripts or adaptations of novels, short stories, and films, including Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and most of Edgar Allan Poe's work. One of the best radio adaptations of a horror novel is John Houseman's 1938 radio production of Dracula, presented as the inaugural broadcast of Mercury Theater on the air. Orson Welles plays the dual roles of Dr. Helsing, the narrator, and Dracula. Even today, Dracula and Carmilla are still engaging audio productions. I'm sorry, there's a copy of Orson Welles playing Dracula somewhere? Somewhere out there? Oh my god. Oh my god. I want to listen to that. Yes, I am contemplating my crush on an old dead man. He was odd and weird and funny and kind of cute. I don't know what to tell you. Go watch his movie, you know, the one. Me trying to be a show-offy nerd, but I don't have the ability to remember the titles of things off the cuff. You know, the one with the sled. Go watch that. It's good. Aural soundscapes and gothic tales. Radio employs powerful manipulative tools. The intimate first-person narrative techniques relies on description and sound and is a method for bringing listeners into the story. Wells introduced this intimate narrative device in which the narrator of the radio drama speaks directly to the individual listener, thus establishing a relationship between the two. Listening to radio is a subjective experience. Listeners take an active role and are challenged to see and imagine the scene. Shocking storylines using first-person singular kept the distracted listener engaged. Wells uses the device as a framing mechanism for Dracula. As Arthur Seward, he addresses his imagined audience and radio listeners at the beginning and at the end of the play with the phrase, "Ladies and gentlemen," and reads to them excerpts from Jonathan Harker's journal, Houseman, Dracula. As the episode ends, Wells switches between dual roles, first as himself and then as Dracula. Speaking as himself, he reassures listeners that Dracula was all in good fun and they can put out the lights and go to sleep, but then, and without cueing the listener, switches to the voice of Dracula to repeat Van Helsing's line, quote, "There are such things as vampires," unquote, leaving the audience uneasy. That must have been so fun. Radio as an aural medium relies on description through narration and sound effects to convey a scene and provoke emotion. When radio is compared to visual mediums, critics find the aural medium deficient and call it a blind medium. However, quote, "Radio's imaginative spectacle presents a powerful dynamic," unquote, and, quote, facilitates a particularly rich way of seeing, unquote. When Harker narrates his arrival at Dracula's castle, the listener sees in his mind's eye the ruin sitting on the edge of a terrible precipice. Simultaneously, the listener and Harker experience fear and horror upon realizing that he is alone as he wanders the echoing hallways, observes the multiple locked doors, and experiences the dank cellar and hears the vampire bride's disembodied laugh. Narrative description provides the listener entry into the story while characters become the listener's emotional proxy. The imaginative and engaged radio listener is at once the vampire and the prey, which is the overall appeal of listening to radio drama. In addition to the radio adaptations of Carmilla, female vampires also feature in 2 other radio horror programs, Graveyard Mansion and The Marquis of Death, though their prey is male rather than female. Radio scriptwriters freely adapted Carmilla by altering the setting and time period and, in one instance, replacing the story of Helen's death for Laura's brush with vampirism. Narratives are transported across time and space. In one adaptation, the setting switches to the 20th century in the United States. Gothic settings for Graveyard Mansion and the Marquis of Death include a French chateau and a plantation in New Orleans, Louisiana, situated near a cemetery and on a bayou, its trees heavy with ghastly Spanish moss, quote, that appear to, quote, writhe with life through clouds of mist and take strange half-human shapes. I don't want to do the unquote through that entire sentence. Fuck that. Scriptwriters and sound effects artists translate Gothic tropes to the aural medium by relying on narrative descriptions and sound. These Gothic landscapes utilize a soundscape of howling winds, rumbling thunder, baying wolves, squealing bats, and disembodied laughter. Evidence of how deliberate narrative choices and characters function is also evident in a character's voice. Dracula's powerful magic voice comes across on radio through Wells' gift for creating direct form of contact between the vampire, its prey, and the listener. Dracula's hypnotically powerful voice transmits through the air and, like radio, communicates across time and space. Though the vampire is physically absent from the scene, Dracula is present with his voice, interjecting at times and speaking slowly and deliberately, drawing out each word for full effect. Dracula to Lucy, "You are flesh of my flesh, blood of my blood." Similarly, Seward's voice speaking in present tense as he enters Lucy's tomb and later encounters the vampire brings the listener into the experience. Quote, "Now we're in the tomb. There, in the coffin, the thing lay, like a nightmare of Lucy, the pointed teeth, the blood-stained mouth. Van Helsing never looked up. From his bag he took out a book, his operating knife, a heavy hammer, and a round wooden stake, 2 or 3 inches thick, sharpened to a fine point, and hardened over a fire." Unquote. I may not have read Dracula, but I have read half of the Anita Blake stories, so it's like kind of the same thing. I was just thinking about her being a vampire killer at the very beginning of the story. I learned so many ways to kill people through those books as a teenager. The scene closes with Van Helsing's, quote, "prayer for the dead," unquote, overlaid with the sound of Lucy's agonized expiration of breath as Seward drives the stake into her heart. As this and other scenes suggest, radio scriptwriters and sound effects artists went about their business with intentionality. Employing the intimate first-person singular technique, description through narration, and realistic sound effects, radio manipulates the listener's imagination and brings him to a particular experience and to a particular emotion. If the vampire is female, the radio listener is primed to be both horrified and possibly stirred, or even titillated by her implied sensuality, as in the Stage 49 production of Dracula. The next section explores radio adaptations of Dracula, Carmilla, and episodes featuring the female vampire. Sorry, I thought I heard my cat doing something weird, but maybe it was just a weird click from the computer. Dracula, Mercury Theater on the Air, 1938. Dracula, adapted for radio by John Houseman, was the inaugural broadcast of Mercury Theater on the Air in the summer 1938. Wells, known for a distinguished film career, was a radio producer and actor who brought to American audiences some of the most sophisticated dramas heard on the air, and is still remembered for his Halloween narration of The War of the Worlds. Howard Cox. Is that how I say his name? Is that how you say his name? I'm sorry. His adaptation of H.G. Wells's science fiction classic. Dracula was Wells's experiment with the first-person singular technique used to create a sense of intimacy between the narrator and individual listener. Through sound and description, chilling incidents are transferred from the printed page to the air. Harker's imprisonment in Dracula's castle, the circumstances on board the Demeter, the death of its crew, and the staking of Lucy Westenra. These dramatic situations are punctuated by discordant music, while the passing of time and new settings are indicated through narrated and dated journal entries and letters read by Wells, playing the dual roles of Dracula and Arthur Seward, a compilation of Lucy Westenra's suitors, Arthur Holmwood and John Seward. Using only dialogue and vocal intonation, listeners recreate in their minds the vivid image of Lucy's transformation from mortal purity into voluptuous wantonness. Lucy's first encounter with the Count is the blue light and sensation of feeling something very sweet and very bitter around her, and as if she is sinking into deep water. Seward narrates his final moments with Lucy, now transforming into a vampire, which for him is both horrifying and arousing, or at least monstrously beautiful. As the sun begins to set, light falls on her face, and a strange change came over her. Lucy's, quote, eyes grew suddenly dull and hard, her breathing heavy, her mouth opened, and the pale gums drawn back, made the teeth look large and sharp, unquote. He next encounters the vampire clutching a child to her breast. On seeing Seward and Van Helsing, Lucy draws back with an angry snarl, and Seward again focuses on her face and watches, quote, her lovely blood-stained mouth grow to an open square, unquote. Mina's experience with the vampire is brief but intense. Speaking of Harker, Seward, and Van Helsing, Mina describes looking out of the window of her room, of seeing a, quote, silent, thin streak of white mist moving across the ground and along the house, unquote, and sensing that the room had gone, quote, heavy and dank and cold, unquote. Under hypnosis, Mina, in a voice that noticeably drops an octave, describes two red eyes shining at her through the mist. Dracula interjects himself into the scene. Speaking to Mina, his disembodied voice is suggestively sensual and sounds almost aroused as he draws out word for word the vow that binds Mina to him, quote, you shall be flesh of my flesh, blood of my blood. 11 years later, the Canadian anthology series Stage 49 broadcast a radio adaptation of Dracula based on selected scenes featuring Harker, Seward, and Renfield, the madman. More important and surprising is the erotically charged scene between the imprisoned Harker and Dracula's vampire brides. Dracula, Stage 49, Item 30. Stage 49's dramatization of Dracula, adapted by George Salverson and screen actor Lorne Greene in the role of Count Dracula, focuses on different scenes dramatized in the 1938 adaptation. Time is allotted to the madman Renfield, who claims Dracula as his lord and master. Dracula's lineage and his relation to Attila the Hun, and more important, Harker's interaction with the vampire sisters 10 minutes into the dramatization. To establish mood, Harker opens the episode with the lines, when the spirit dies but the dead live, the dark god of the night is a beast, unquote. A wolf howls, and Harker speaks again, warning listeners that this is his last entry. The scene transitions to the coach carrying Harker to Dracula's castle. He narrates his trip, speaking rapidly and keeping pace with the sound made by the speeding wheels of his coach. Edgy, frantic, and rapid violin music escalate in volume as the scene transitions to Harker's seduction. An evening shortly after Harker's arrival, and while he is writing in his journal, Harker hears a female voice. For this scene, Salverson relies on the radio technique of narrative description to cue the listener. The next 3 minutes of the radio play are dedicated to Harker's seduction scene. The first vampire to approach him is the golden-haired vampire, who attempts and almost succeeds in seducing him. She speaks to him in a voice of honeyed sweetness with a hint of malice, carefully emphasizing each word. Quote, "You are so young, so strong, so handsome," unquote. Dracula interrupts in time to stop the vampire's attack on Harker. Angered at the interruption, the golden-haired vampire accuses the Count of never having loved. Dracula responds, "Yes, I, too, can love," foreshadowing of his bond with Lucy and Mina. The vampire with golden hair, eyes dark as rubies, rich red lips, and sharp white teeth move toward his throat to kiss him. Before she delivers her bite, the sisters interrupt and move toward their prey, fighting over who will kiss him first. The golden-haired vampire tries to appease them with the promise that, quote, "there are kisses for them all," unquote. A snarling Dracula intercedes and promises they can have Harker after he has finished with him. Harker and listeners familiar with the source text realize Dracula will appease the vampires when they hear the wail of an infant. A musical bridge transitions to an obviously distressed mother shouting from the courtyard, accusing Dracula and his den of thieves and monsters of stealing her child. Quote, "You have her blood, now give me my child," unquote. Lucy's monstrous vampirism is the focus of a later scene. As in the novel, Van Helsing and Seward see her clasping a child to her breast. Seward's attention is drawn to her face, which he describes as beautiful, though with the sunrise it twists with rage and becomes beast-like. Seward's attention is drawn to her blood-red lips and Van Helsing's to her pointed teeth and red eyes. Blood-red lips promise sex. When Seward realizes the blood on Lucy belongs to the child in her arms, his desire turns to horror. She was drinking that child's... She was drinking that child's paws. Okay? Seward has another final encounter with Lucy shortly before she is staked. Lucy tries and almost succeeds in seducing him. Using the intimate forms of his name, Johnny, the vampire Lucy tells Harker, "My arms are hungry for you. Come, and we can be together." As Seward makes a move toward her, the sun rises, her face twists with rage at the interruption, and she escapes to her tomb. Van Helsing convinces Seward they must dispense with the vampire. Mina's escape from Lucy's fate is glossed over and only alluded to in her declaration that she is cold and exhausted. As in the Stoker's novel, Seward and Van Helsing kill Dracula. Radio representations of Carmilla and the female vampire. William Veeder considers Carmilla a Victorian Gothic masterpiece, a tale of repression in La Fanu, a master of the Gothic who, quote, converts the discovery of the monster into a revelation of human nature itself, unquote. While Dracula embodies Victorian anxieties on matters of race and gender, the female vampires of radio are fiendish/diabolical presences who represent the depravity of women. The vampire woman, a libidinous, predatory creature who quite literally loves her food, is as evident in the behavior of the Stage 49 vampires in their encounter with Harker, share an affinity with the cinematic vamps Theda Bara and Clara Bow, presented as wicked, conniving women who prey on men and behave as sexual sociopaths, and who refuse to comply with conventions. Radio adaptations of Carmilla broadcast on the Columbia Workshop in 1940 and the Sears Radio Theater in 1979 present slightly different versions of Le Fanu's novella, but retain the characterization of Carmilla as a libidinous vampire. Carmilla, the Columbia Workshop. Lucille Fletcher, a talented radio scriptwriter who authored the radio suspense play Sorry, Wrong Number, adapted Le Fanu's Carmilla. I have no idea if I'm saying that man's name right, by the way. Le Fanu, Le Fanu. Carmilla for a 1940 summer broadcast of the Columbia Workshop. If you just say something with enough confidence, anybody will believe that you're saying it right. That's why I say nothing with confidence, so everybody knows I'm full of shit. Fletcher's revisioning of the original text focuses on the death of Helen, Carmilla's first victim. Listeners familiar with the original text who expect this vampire tale to provide closure with the death of the vampire will be sorely disappointed. Fletcher alters time and setting. Modern conveniences transport the novella to the 20th century and a house located on a street called Maple Hill. A long black limousine replaces the carriage, and a telephone replaces letter writing. This dramatization opens with a panicked phone call from Helen's father, J. Dodge, to Reverend Witherspoon to help him save his daughter. Witherspoon arrives and visits Helen's room. She weakly calls for Camilla. Dodge narrates the strange events that occurred 2 months earlier and that led to this moment. Dodge begins his story with the arrival of a black limousine racing down the state highway and swiping a tree. Dodge helps a, quote, tall woman dressed in black, unquote, and, quote, poor little Carmilla, unquote, out of the car. Both girls, Helen and Carmilla, speak in voices that suggest their young age. As Carmilla wakes late in the afternoon, to the listener's ear, she almost purrs as she yawns. Helen gently fusses at her for sleeping in. Carmilla explains that the real time to get up is when, quote, the light is soft and golden and the sky is pale blue, unquote. Later, Carmilla will adopt a suggestive, sensuous voice. Sensuous tone as she explains to Helen the meaning of the passion flower, quote, as a symbol of human passion and our love, unquote. Helen is visited in the night by a black cat and begins to waste away. Carmilla's behavior is bizarre, and Helen finds her covered with blood. Dodge, adopting an authoritative tone, accuses Carmilla of sneaking into the village at night to meet a boyfriend, suggesting that she might be sexually active and perhaps a negative influence on Helen. Dodge warns Carmilla that he has, quote, a good mind to turn her over to the police, but won't, for Helen's sake, provided she leaves at once, unquote. Carmilla scoffs at his accusation, which elevates Dodge's anger. He threatens to call the police, and Carmilla tries to stab him with a letter opener. Good for her. Listeners are treated to an audible scuffle between the two while the shrieking and shouting alerts Helen. Carmilla mocks Dodge for trying to get rid of her and implies a level of intimacy with Helen. Quote, you thought you could keep me out of here, didn't you? You thought Helen would let me be sent away. Do you think walls or doors or locks would keep me away from Helen? No, Mr. Dodge, she's mine. Do you hear that? Mine. Oh, see how beautifully she sleeps? She's happy now. Do you know what she's dreaming of, Mr. Dodge? I do. She's dreaming, pause, about a fountain, pause, an old stone fountain in the moonlight, unquote. Carmilla threatens that a great black cat will visit Helen and is interrupted by the sound of a clap of thunder. Dodge describes what he sees, quote, with one leap, she jumped on Helen's bed. I saw her teeth bared like fangs, like the pointed fangs of a wolf. And then suddenly the room went dark. Unquote, I guess? Wait, no, maybe? Man, they're not very good at finishing off their quotes. With Witherspoon's help, Dodge realizes Carmilla is a vampire and enlists the village sheriff to help him dispose of her. Opening the coffin of the 300-year-old Marsala, they find the corpse of a young girl with red hair. Helen dies, and Dodge's surprise and horror are obvious when he sobs with the news that Carmilla is still in the house. The vampire lives to stalk her next victim, Carmilla. Sears Radio Theater, Carmilla, 1979. Carmilla was adapted once again for a March 1979 40-minute broadcast for the themed drama anthology program, the Sears Radio Theater. Vincent Price hosts the themed Mystery Night and opens this episode with a stanza from Lord Byron's The Giaour and a short explanation of vampire lore to create the mood. Quote, but first on earth as vampire sent, thy corse shall from its tomb be rent, then ghastly haunt thy native place, and suck the blood of all thy race. Unquote. The basic plot line follows La Fanu's novella with few exceptions. Carmilla is set in a village on the outskirts of Vienna in 1922. Amy's young age is evident in her light, clear voice, while Carmilla's voice is an octave deeper, more mature, and a bit stilted. Amy identifies herself as 18 years old and narrates her story as she writes in her journal. She believes fate brought Carmilla to her. Because the listener can only depend on sound to provide insight into the story and characters, the last few minutes of this drama leave the audience unsure whether the romance is that of friends, lovers, or even more innocent, that of mother and daughter. Early in the episode, Carmilla declares she will not love anyone else as much as she loves Amy, and describes her kind of friendship as selfish. Sensing that Carmilla has a secret, Amy asks about her background. Carmilla refuses to disclose information about herself, stating she is under vows, but promises to tell Amy and the listener everything, leaving both to translate the final comment, "Blood is life." Amy suffers agonizing dreams of a monstrous cat morphing into a blood-drenched Carmilla. The voice of Amy's dead mother interrupts her narrative with the warning that the assassin is in the house. The next scene is made more sinister with the obvious. Carmilla attacks Amy. That Amy is 18 does not prohibit the listener from, perhaps, feeling slightly disturbed by the series of events. They take a taxi to the ruins of Karnstein to enjoy a picnic. As it grows dark, Amy suggests they return home, but Carmilla tells her, "Neither of us is going home. This is our home now." Amy is surprised by Carmilla's vice-like grip around her wrist and the acrid-smelling cloth placed over her mouth and nose. Amy awakens in a dark chamber to find Carmilla sitting next to her with her, quote, "her once lovely face twisted in a diabolical grin," unquote. Amy is unsure whether she is dead or alive. Carmilla, speaking in a seductive voice, explains that death is happiness and promises to lead the younger woman to a place of refuge. In other words, the sleep of the vampire, though she has yet to disclose her vampirism. Amy's hysteria builds. Carmilla promises her that, quote, "Before the night is over, I shall drain you to the brink. I have learned to be gentle. You need not be afraid," unquote. Amy's voice is confused, sad, and slightly hysterical during the rest of their exchange. "Amy, I thought you were my friends. Carmilla, always. You are the companion I have been seeking. You have seen your last sunrises. I will keep you alive as a vampire. Tomorrow night you begin. Tomorrow night you make your first kill." Amy, in a voice filled with terror and pleads for pity, but is told that they must rest while they can. "Goes to sleep, my precious child," unquote. That was kind of a fucked up little quote there, but... This exchange can be interpreted as the promise of a more intimate relationship, or the innocent words of a mother to her child when Carmilla's voice assumes a maternal tone and refers to the younger woman as child. At the conclusion of the traumatization, Carmilla, even with her staking imminent as Dodge rescues his daughter, promises never to be gone from Amy's memory, even in death. Quote, "The Marquis of Death, Hall of Fantasy." Why did I say quote? The Marquis of Death, Hall of Fantasy, 1953. The Marquis of Death, written by Richard Thorne, aired on the horror anthology Hall of Fantasy in 1953. This is a standard vampire tale featuring two brothers who encounter a seductive female vampire during their stay in France. David, a writer, and his brother Everett, ordered to get 6 months of rest, retreat to France for a holiday. David suffers from writer's block, and Everett from an unknown condition. André Decour, a local doctor, entertains David with the story of the mysterious Marquis in a heavy French accent. Everett never speaks. The Marquis of Death is described as a beautiful woman with the skin the color of pale ivory and hypnotic eyes that seem to look through their victim. David will experience the Marquis's hypnotic powers later in the play. David needs material for a book, so Andre suggests a story featuring vampires and proceeds to tell the story of the Marquis of Death, who has been dead for 150 years. Following her marriage, the Marquis disappeared for a month with her father, a man in black driving a carriage. This description and the words he exchanges with the Marquis suggest the possibility that he is Dracula. Father and daughter return, and he promises the Marquis that now she has what she needs to live as long as time exists, a comment that suggests immortality. The villagers notice the Marquis develops an aversion to sunlight and sleeps all day, has strange marks on her neck, which suggest incest if they were left by her father, and that those closest to her begin to die, first her husband, and then, one by one, her servants. The villagers are convinced she is one of the undead. Years pass, and the Marquis disappears but returns to haunt the riverbank. David and Andre see the Marquis dressed in a black gown walking along the riverbank. They are startled by her great beauty, white skin, and long raven tresses. Later, Andre and David realize Everett has taken off for a walk alone. Anticipating danger, they follow him. David sees a strange woman walking near the chateau, and the unidentified Marquis speaks to him in English with a heavy French accent. Her tone is seductive and suggests feigned innocence as she tries to seduce the second brother. David is jarred back to reality by the sound of Andre calling his name. Everett is found near the river with the mark of the vampire bat on his neck and nearly drained of blood. The vampire bat flies into Everett's room, bites him, and he dies a short time later. David, nearly hysterical by this time, joins Andre and the doctor in their search for the vampire's cave. David encounters the Marquis again and persuades him to look into her eyes. Before she has any effect, Andre shouts at him, bringing him back to reality. The men notice a path in the woods and follow it into the Marquis' cave. Within seconds of spotting the coffin, a bat enters the cave and transforms into the beautiful Marquis. The sound of flapping bat wings and the slide of a coffin lid suggests the vampire has been found. As the sun rises, the episode comes to a climax. The discordant music and the vampire's screams mix with the yells of the men as they struggle to stake her. Graveyard Mansion, The Witch's Tale, 1933. Alonzo Dean Cole's The Witch's Tale was the earliest radio horror anthology series on American radio and was soon followed by other horror anthologies featuring monsters of all kinds. Cool. Cole's Graveyard Mansion is set on a Gothic landscape, a plantation home in New Orleans, Louisiana. Brothers Alan and Curtis have inherited the property and arrive from the north to claim the property. Typical of these vampire narratives, the male victims, again 2 brothers, are seduced by and fall in love with the woman who they realize is too late is a vampire. Yeah, this is just making me want to listen to them. I wonder why a thing that just summarizes the plot of things is in a literary journal. Locals call the Ted Gross plantation owned by the Blanchard family Graveyard Mansion because of the house's proximity to a cemetery and its reputation as the House of the Living Dead. Alan and Curtis unknowingly visit the vampire's tomb, a claustrophobic vault as dark as a coal mine, and feel the flutter of bats' wings about their faces. On the first night in the house, the brothers are walking in the cemetery when they encounter the ghostly figure of a woman dressed in white who disappears into the mist. This encounter and their visit to the cellar spook the brothers. Alan voices concern that fear has emasculated him and apologizes for being afraid and acting like a baby. Curtis reassures him, and likely the listener, that fear is natural and admits to feeling, quote, cold shivers up and down his spine for hours after visiting the burial vault, unquote. Borrowing an episode from La Fanu's Carmilla, Curtis finds a miniature portrait of the estate's prior owner, a beautiful woman named Antoinette, who has been dead for more than 100 years. While walking along the bayou in the moonlight, the brothers again encounter the phantom woman. On closer inspection, she appears to be, quote, a knockout and a healthy-looking flesh and blood girl. Look at that lady over there with total knockout. She's got healthy-looking flesh and blood. Woo, boy. What a hottie. 10 out of 10. No icks found. Nettie introduces herself and suggests they might be distant relatives. However, their possible family ties do not stop Alan and Nettie's quick engagement. Neither man is suspicious that Nettie only goes out after sunset and prefers to walk along the bayou and in the cemetery. Look, that's like some people are night owls who like to hang out in the cemetery and the swamp. If I lived there, that's what I would be doing. I'm just saying. Some people work from home, okay? Listeners familiar with the vampire trope would obviously anticipate how this story will unfold. Soon after the engagement, Curtis recognizes a change in his brother. Alan, similar to the women in the dramatizations of Dracula and Carmilla, sleeps too much and dreams deeply. He reports being visited in his room by an unnamed woman who kisses him on the neck. Alan begins to waste away, and the only evidence of something amiss is the strange mark on his neck. Dr. Brochard, a man of science and of superstition, identifies this site as left by, quote, the fangs of some beast, unquote. Alan dies, leaving Curtis alone with Nettie. Curtis continues the narration of events while Nettie remains silent. Brochard, Van Helsing's double, recognizes her as one of the undead and, for the listener's benefit, describes the vampire as an evil spirit that, quote, rises from their grave at midnight, clothed in human flesh, controlled by blood drained by living bodies, unquote. Curtis and I already forget how I was saying his name, Brochard, track Nettie to her tomb. Curtis refuses to believe that the girl in the coffin is a vampire, and within the final seconds, the scraping sound of her coffin lid being removed suggests her fate. The episode climaxes with the sound of a hammer driving a stake into Antoinette's heart, and the vampire screams as she turns to dust. Conclusion. American radio's celebrated golden years spanned two of the most important decades in history. From the 1930s through the post-war 1940s, radio was the most important media next to the newspaper. Despite the obvious limitations of radio as an aerial medium, dramatists and special effects artists managed to work with the strengths of this somewhat restrictive medium by incorporating narrative techniques and sophisticated and realistic sound effects to manipulate the listener's experience of the story. At the height of its popularity, radio was innovative. Radio dramatists intentionally gave plays emotional dimension, creating a suggestion of intimacy between the narrator, the character, and the listener, making the listening experience more intense. Female vampires in this selection of radio dramas are evidence of how well scriptwriters used the aesthetics of sound to draw in listeners and, to some extent, addressed the taboo. Radio dramas portrayed sensual vampires on a sexualized quest for blood and, as females, disrupted culturally perceived discrete patterns of sexual behavior. End of that. Damn. Wait. They're like books on this? Theater of the Mind, Imagination, Aesthetics, and the American Radio Drama. Carmilla, the Arts of Repression, Texas Studies in Literature and Language. The Marquis of Death. The Monster Show, A Cultural History of Horror. Ooh, that sounds cool. Stage 49, Item 30. Archive.org. Dracula, Bram Stoker. Uses and gratifications. Blah, blah, blah. Lost Sound, The Forgotten Art of Radio Storytelling. Monsters in America, Our Historical Obsession with the Hideous and the Haunting. Oh, that sounds cool. Peace. Ugh. Salem Witches, Frontier Wilderness Beasts, Freak Show Odysseys, Alien Invasions, Freddy Krueger. From our colonial past to the present, the monster in all its various forms has been a staple of American culture, a masterful survey of our grim and often disturbing past. Monsters in America uniquely brings together history and culture studies to expose the dark obsessions that have helped create our national identity. Monsters are not just fears of the individual psyche, historian Scott Poole explains, but are concoctions of the public imagination, reactions to cultural influences, social change, and historical events. Conflicting anxieties about race, class, gender, sexuality, religious beliefs, science, and politics manifest as haunting beings among the populace. From Victorian-era mad scientists to modern-day serial killers, new monsters appear as American society evolves, paralleling fluctuating challenges to the cultural status quo. Consulting newspaper accounts, archival materials, personal papers, comic books, film, and oral histories, Poole adroitly illustrates how the creation of the monstrous other not only reflects society's fears but shapes actual historical behavior and becomes a cultural reminder of inhuman acts. It doesn't have like a preview. Usually you can read the first couple pages of a book. We are looking at paperback. For example, this is what we're doing today. Get over it. Contents. Oh, the warning to the unsuspecting reader. The bloody chords of memory, monstrous beginnings, goth Americana, weird silence, alien invasions, deviant bodies, haunted houses, undead Americans, conclusions, worst things waiting. That sounds fun. Why am I looking at this? Preface to the original edition. I don't want to read the preface to the original edition. Whatever. Fictional vampires in the 19th and 20th century, a new companion to Gothic. I have a lot of things that I want to read now. Feminism, sex role exchanges, and other subliminal fantasies in Bram Stoker's Dracula. Monster theory, reading culture. Ooh, what's this? It's this journal. Monster theory, reading culture is actually the journal? Maybe not, no. Because there's monster culture, 7 theses. Beowulf is palimpsest. Monstrosity, illegibility, denegation, demon, B.P. Nickel, and the resistance to postmodernism. Monstrous identity. Oh, is this a book? Maybe. It is. Yeah. It says for book. We live in a time of monsters. Monsters provide a key to understanding the culture that spawned them. So argue the essays in this wide-ranging and fascinating collection that asks the question, what happens when critical theorists take the study of monsters seriously as a means of examining our culture? In viewing the monstrous body as a metaphor for the cultural body, the contributors to monster theory consider beasts, demons, freaks, and fiends as symbolic expressions of cultural unease that pervade a society and shape its collective behavior. Through a historical sampling of monsters, these essays argue that our fascination for the monstrous testifies to our continued desire to explore difference and prohibition. Cool. Preface. We live in a time of monsters. Channel surf for a moment. Britain's Channel 4 reports a new menace of the technological to be practiced against the organic. Russia has developed a terrorist dream weapon, a nuclear bomb the size of a baseball that utilizes a mysterious compound called red mercury to, quote, destroy human life but leave buildings and machinery intact, unquote. This explosive device contributes to the widespread fear that the synthetic mechanistic is destined to eradicate its own creators, an anxiety that could be labeled Frankenstein's monster syndrome. Dr. Sam Cohen, the inventor of the neutron bomb, declares, I find the entire business terrifying. The highest grossing film of 1993, indeed of all time, is Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park. The plot of this movie come marketing juggernaut involves the technology-assisted return from the dead of primordial monsters who menace the integrity of the American family by threatening to devour its children. That Jurassic Park would have been a far superior piece of cinema if its computer-animated velociraptors had in fact ingested the kids they merely threatened suggests that these monsters arrive at a time when traditional nuclear families perhaps need to be troubled. On November 2nd, 1993, Cincinnati voters amended the city's charter to bar the city council from enacting or enforcing laws that give equal legal protection to lesbian, gay, or bisexual citizens in seeking employment, housing, and public accommodations. Colorado suggests with its own similar ban, while Hawaii debates the legality of same-sex marriages, and the U.S. military wonders if straight soldiers are safe sharing the same dormitories and showers as gay. When serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer was tried for his crimes, the press repeatedly linked his monstrousness, defined both psychologically and legally, to his sexuality. Normal serial killers prey upon women and children. Jeffrey's father, Lionel, recently published A Father's Story, a biography that examines the early life of his cannibalistic son. The book puzzles over how a boy who, as a child, seemed sweet and docile could turn out so terribly wrong. Which makes me think about, oh God, it was such a good book. We need to talk about Kevin. I think it's what it's called. To talk about Kevin. Yeah, it was a movie, but it was also a book first, and I love that fucking book so much. There's a book that's seemingly about a fucked up child, but at its core is about trauma. It's excellent. Has nothing to do with monsters unless you mean like school shooters as monsters, if you want to go that route, which this book does, I guess. The famous surgeon's photo of the Loch Ness Monster has been revealed through a deathbed confession to have been a fake, a construction of twigs bound to a toy submarine. No explanation yet why 3,000 other people have testified to seeing Nessie since the 1934 photograph was taken. Meanwhile, the Yeti, Sasquatch, and Champ, the monster of Lake Champlain, remain at large. Support groups for men and women who have been abducted and maltreated by aliens are meeting in New York, Boston, and San Francisco. A Harvard psychiatrist who runs such gatherings recently published a book validating their experiences. Some new and recent films, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Wolf, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Interview with a Vampire, Mary Riley's Species, and Nightmare on Elm Street the Sixth. This collection of cultural soundbites taken almost at random from the media barrage constitutive of postmodern living embodies in monstrous form a commentary upon fin de siècle America, a society that has created and commodified ambient fear, a kind of total fear that saturates day-to-day living, prodding and silently antagonizing but never speaking its own name. This anxiety manifests itself symptomatically as a cultural fascination with monsters, a fixation that is born with the twin desire to name that which is different, to apprehend, and to domesticate, and therefore to disempower that which threatens. And so the monster appears simultaneously as the demonic disemboweler of slasher films and as a wide-eyed, sickeningly cute plush toy for children, Velociraptor and Barney. I'm not going to read this whole thing. Interesting. There you go. If you want like a couple paragraphs from the premise of monster theory reading culture. Shadow of a Shade, a survey of vampirism in literature. Sears Radio Theater. No, but I want to know more about like the evil monsters of radio dramas. I want to listen to that. That's really cool. The Marquis of Death. Well, there's a whole YouTube page for it. Oops. Well, oh. Stop telling me. I'm not allowed to watch YouTube videos because of my ad blocker. Oh my god. Oh my god. The classic archives. Cool. Okay. I wouldn't mind going to 8:30 because I started at 6:30, but I'm kind of out of things to read because if I started the next one, that's gonna last like 40 more minutes. Then again, I don't know. I have the time. The sky is clear and the moon is full. Images of female vampires in music video. What? Kathryn W. Taylor Coleman served as a lecturer of English at Brite State University for nearly a decade. Her scholarship focuses on feminist criticism of popular fiction and media. Coleman has 2 novels published. She holds an MFA in writing popular fiction from Seton Hill University and MA in literature from Wright State University, and is currently a PhD candidate in American Culture Studies at Bowling Green State University. Okay. I'm sorry. Images of female vampires in music video. Don't you want to read this? I love being a nerd. Let's look at the works cited. Sandu by Olivia Newton-John. The Lore of the Vampire, Gender Fiction and Fandom from Bram Stoker to Buffy. Unruly Media, YouTube Music Video in the New Digital Cinema. Experiencing Music Video, Aesthetics and Cultural Contexts. Total Eclipse of the Heart. I Want My MTV, The Uncensored Story of the Music Video Revolution. Henry James and Sexuality. What is Third Wave Feminism? A New Directions Essay. A New Directions Essay? Bisexual Eraser in Lesbian Vampire Film Theory. Well, sure. Lesbian vampire theory operates within the matrix of feminism, queer theory, and horror studies. Bisexuality has a strange relationship with queer theory, and Christopher James provides a compelling account of how bisexuality has been appropriated by queer, lesbian, and gay theory. The strategy James terms appropriation without representation occurs when the theorists do not include bisexuality as a sexual orientation in their analysis, yet they label characters that behave in bisexual ways as gay or lesbian. Bisexual characters have been written out of scholarship about lesbian vampire films through this appropriation. A bisexual epistemological perspective accounts for a broader understanding of the sexuality expressed in films. Oh god, I got distracted by clicking things around. In films that are traditionally included in the lesbian vampire subgenre, such as The Hunger, Blood and Roses, and Daughters of Darkness. This article charts how bisexuality functions invisibly within these so-called lesbian vampire films and how scholarship surrounding the films contributes to bisexual erasure. Huh. Gay now. I bet that's about Buffy. Pet Cemetery. Bloodlust in the Female Narrative and Bram Stoker's Dracula. Physical. Olivia Newton-John. Monster Metaphors. Notes on Michael Jackson's Thriller. Gender, Politics, and MTV Voicing the Difference. Okay. This is fine. Dracula's Post-Feminist Daughters in the 21st Century. Dracula's Daughters, the Female Vampire on Film. Dracula's Vampires and Other Undead Forms, Essay on Gender, Race, and Culture. Dog Days Are Over. Oh my god. Oh god, I want to read this. The Sky is Clear and the Moon is Full. Images of female vampires in music video. Yeah. Vampire imagery in art and entertainment media can be used as metaphors for cultural issues that shift over time. Many popular music genres have used vampire imagery in much more allegorical ways, particularly when discussing gender and sexuality. In this essay, I will examine 2 music videos featuring female artists discussing how they employ vampirism to denote sexual agency. In the case of one video, Deborah Harry's I Want That Man. This vampire imagery has specific relevance to the idea of gendered street space as defined in relation to music video by Lisa A. Lewis. In the second video, Goldfrapp's Alive. Not only is lead singer Alison Goldfrapp depicted as a vampire, but so are multiple other women, leading to a sequence culminating in a symbolic dismantling of the patriarchy. Goldfrapp's piece is also notable as a work adhering to Carol Furnalis's analysis of music video in the age of YouTube, particularly its heavy use of 20th century cultural reference. Decades earlier, music scholar Andrew Goodwin examined this practice at length through defining different uses of intertextuality. Vampire imagery, even imagery specific to female vampires, has been depicted and interpreted in multiple creative products for over a century. These images predate not only the music video media form, but television and, in some cases, traditional feature-length films, and their literary precursors created a firmer set of cultural understandings of the vampire trope than folklore alone ever did. According to Millie Williamson, the vampire offers a way of inhabiting difference with pride, for embracing defiantly an identity that the world at large sees as other. This is exemplified in Bram Stoker's Dracula, the most direct narrative source of much of what we think of today as contemporary fictional vampire lore, including the creature's origins as humans transfigured into blood-drinking immortals. In discussing the 1992 adaptation of Dracula directed by Francis Ford Coppola, Lisa Nystrom writes that it retains a great deal of Stoker's individual commentary relating to women and to female power. This adaptation of Dracula highlights the strong female presence felt within the story by centering much of its action around the woman of the narrative. Isn't that the guy? Didn't he make the Godfather movies? I never watched them. I always thought I would be a cold day in hell if I ever watched them. They sound so boring. Stoker's novel makes great use of the female characters' perspectives through their journal entries, and the film goes further by creating a new female-centric storyline not present in the original. Dracula himself is a sexually ambiguous figure, keeping a harem-like group of brides at his disposal, but he also expresses rage when, after toying with Jonathan Harker in a manner that is overtly sexual, Dracula feels they have spoiled the man, whom he seems to have claimed for himself, implying Dracula himself is sexually invested in Harker. Dracula's claiming of Mina Harker involves her consuming his blood in a way that mimics breastfeeding. The character of Lucy goes from feisty but feminine to overtly sexual, a, quote, transformation that sparks a reversal of gender roles that the male characters of the novel find at once both repulsive and intriguing, unquote. For some scholars, female vampires' intake of blood is equivalent to oral sex, but the addition of a biting and blood consumption threat conflates this with castration anxiety. When we combine, quote, the threat of castration, unquote, with, quote, uninhibited sensuality, unquote, one can interpret, quote, the vampires in Dracula as objects of lust, desire, terror, and disgust all at once. In order to deal with these conflicting sensations, Stoker turns to the fate that must befall all women who renounce their traditional feminine roles. They must be destroyed, unquote. Nystrom notes that, quote, the fear of the castrating female may be timeless, unquote, but that it also manifests differently as waves of feminism shift. For Dracula, the novel is an allegory of the new woman and ambivalent reactions thereof. This is exemplified in the character of Mina, but even more so in Lucy. Vampire as other became the new image in the later 20th century with films like The Hunger, The Lost Boys, Near Dark, An Interview with the Vampire, depicting allegorical vampires whose stories could be stand-ins for closeted queerness, drug addiction, or AIDS. These, quote, morally ambiguous, sympathetic vampires, unquote, were able to, quote, lure audiences with the pathos of their predicament and their painful awareness of outsiderdom, unquote. Even as Dracula as other provoked fear in 19th century audiences, this same quality of in the 20th century becomes, quote, a source of empathy and identification, unquote. However, female characters in post-1990s vampire media are often cast in the role of slayer or lover, rather than vampire herself. When a female vampire is depicted, she is frequently associated with lesbianism, a situation Nicole Richter discusses at length as being a problematic critical reading, erasing female bisexuality and limiting characters' behavior to focus on those with a scopophilic appeal to male viewers. scopophilic. Interesting. Several of these later vampire films have been influenced by music video tropes. Music video is a concrete, specific, and recognized media genre is typically considered to have begun with the premiere of the music television cable channel in 1981. However, in the era in which MTV predominantly played music videos, approximately mid-1981 to the mid-1990s, research on the music video form tended to conflate individual clips with the media flow of MTV as a delivery entity. Additionally, scholars were apt to debate each other's approaches, with some taking a film/auteur/narrative approach, and others castigating this approach, preferring to look at individual techniques, the fusion of sound and images, or issues of illusion, pastiche, parody, remediation, and/or intertextuality. With YouTube and similar online platforms replacing traditional cable channels as the primary delivery method for music video, it is easier than ever to isolate individual clips as their own entities, removing them from a visual radio or commercial flow, and replacing them instead into a format viewable more as a micro program or short film. Although YouTube and Vivo allow viewers to create playlists or view videos in an auto-playing flow format, they also create means by which videos can be deliberately viewed by themselves or shared on social media platforms. When interpreting clips now from any era of production, it is ever more possible to remove them from their original context as pieces on our larger media landscape and instead look at their individual artistic elements. Carol Vernalis and Andrew Goodwin analyze videos' look, feel, purpose, and combination of sound and imagery, but other scholars add an additional lens. When looking at gender, then, Lisa A. Lewis enters the discussion. Her 1990 book, Gender Politics and MTV, Voicing the Difference, brings up issues of music videos' appeal to male and female audiences and the symbolic use of street scenes to discuss and prescribe the gendering of spaces. As Lewis writes, individual music videos aiming to appeal to a young male demographic made the, quote, the image of the street an overarching sign system for male adolescent discourse, unquote. And in order to, quote, invoke this attachment of young males to the street, male musicians were showing loitering on sidewalks, strolling along avenues, and riding in cars, unquote. All of which made leisure seem appealing. Leisure, Lewis posits, is, quote, the arena in which adolescent boys carve out their own domain, unquote. And engaging in leisure on the street, quote, summarized perfectly the male adolescent quest for adventure, rebellion, sexual encounter, peer relationships, and male privilege, unquote. Thus, quote, representing boys' privileged position with respect to their female peers, unquote, who were not permitted to engage in street-based leisure. Girls on the streets were not subjects, they were objects. Women, of course, cannot occupy street spaces because they are sites of danger. Women can only use streets as routes, not endpoints, because of several threats, the appearance of prostitution and becoming a victim of violence. Vernalis and Goodwin use a number of terms to describe music videos' tendency to, quote, earlier or other works, either within the music video media genre or from other popular cultural texts, including film, literature, theater, and television. Intertextuality is the relationship between texts, and a pastiche is a work imitating another, and remediation, when applied to media textuality, refers to a reuse, with the implication of improvement upon of an idea originating in another source. While none of these terms mean quite the same thing, they all speak to a practice of allusion, implied references to other works, which is implied in both I Want That Man and Alive. I would suggest when a viewer is aware of a video's source allusions, it can make the viewing experience richer and more informed, but that taking the piece as a new creation, much like removing it from the confines of the MTV channel flow viewing model, can be helpful as well. When describing her process for directing several early Madonna videos, Mary Lambert describes drawing on diverse ideas in collaboration with the then fledgling singer, the two of them cobbling concepts together in ways that may not necessarily amount to a thoughtful homage to a particular idea. However, if one considers auteur/musician intent and the tendency toward illusion as one prong of a complex system of illusion, original concept, non-traditional narrative structure, and synthesis of sound and visual, its influence over the resulting piece can be considered in a more balanced way. When looking at the narrative elements of a video, Goodwin argues that beyond a discernible storyline, videos exhibiting amplification or the introduction of, quote, new meanings that do not conflict with the lyrics but that add layers of meaning, unquote, may indicate the mark of a good video. The two videos under consideration represent varying degrees of non-realistic/straightforward narrative structures, although not precisely anti-narratives, that Goodwin also describes, that exhibit this phenomenon of amplification. Simultaneously, they also will represent a high degree of allusion to other popular texts, specifically the image of the vampire. Vampires have featured in the videos of pop and rock artists including Fall Out Boy, Gnarls Barkley, Ali and AJ, and several gothic rock bands, all of which took inspiration from the post-21st century vision of the angst-ridden and morally ambiguous vampire scene in television series like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and in the Twilight franchise. But in the 1898, when Mary Lambert directed the video for Deborah Harry's single I Want That Man from her album Deaf, Dumb, and Blonde, the source inspiration would have been older. The piece has allusions to more gothic exemplars of vampire style, albeit with a trash element of homelessness or traveler culture as depicted in The Lost Boys and Near Dark. The vampire imagery itself is similar to John Badham's version of Dracula, starring Frank Langella, as well as the Hammer films Dark Shadows and The Hunger. I Want That Man was not Harry's first video. She spent most of the 1970s as the lead singer of the band Blondie, which made videos for most of their singles, even in the years before MTV premiered. I Want That Man charted in the top 20 in 4 countries, reaching the top 5 on the U.S. Billboard Modern Rock Tracks chart. Though some signature elements from director Mary Lambert's Madonna videos can be seen in I Want That Man, including frequent extreme close-ups of the singer's face, colored lighting conveying strong moods, and a more concrete narrative than seen in the work of other directors. It may indeed be Lambert's work as the director of Pet Sematary that is most influential on this video. Pet Sematary is not a vampire film, but it does contain horror tropes, such as undead creatures and murder, and Lambert's use of darkened interiors with high contrast lighting can be seen in both the film and Harry's video. The song itself is a dance pop track running approximately 3 minutes. It features heavy use of synthesized keyboards, drums, and electric guitar, courtesy of Harry's frequent musical partner, Kristine. Lyrically, the narrator of I Want That Man is ambitious, driven, and assertive in what she wants, describing her desire for expensive cars and clothing, money, and to be Queen of the USA, who experiences greater and greater success as the new century approaches, which she believes will be, quote, be much better for a girl like me, unquote, perhaps due to her extreme acquisitiveness. The listing of things the narrator desires speaks of power and money more so than artistic integrity or fame, and she eschews the latter and seeks to redistribute wealth to herself. Quote, I'll keep the money, you can have the fame. Everything that's yours will soon be mine, unquote. Though this abject greed is typical for the extreme capitalism of the 1980s, hearing it expressed by a woman in an aggressive, growling, unapologetic voice is unusual and could be read as empowering and assertive. In particular, the idea that the next century will be better for the narrator's type of woman could be seen as a longing for more progressive views of women's roles. I got distracted. I clicked out. Why did I do that? Which are perhaps still a bit far into the future. However, most of all, the narrator is seeking male companionship, repeating the refrain that, more than all the money and possessions and power she desires, I want that man. It is important to note she does not name the man, does not say she loves him, but instead has merely noticed him in the very back row. The man does not appear to notice the narrator, however. He won't even look me in the eye, and her want of him is based solely on physical desire. Even with his seeming lack of attention to the narrator, she seems unwilling to chastise herself for it, expressing high levels of self-esteem through both the song's lyrical content and Harry's brash vocal style. One ultimately gets the impression the narrator's life will not end if she does not accomplish her goal of attaining the unnamed man's affections, but that her already glamorous life pursuit will simply be made more fun by acquiring him. And fun is perhaps a key tonal element here. The song is in a fast tempo and major key, and Harry adds flourishes of whoops and laughter to the vocal tract. For an upbeat dance song, it seems perhaps incongruous to include horror imagery in the music video, but if one looks at the vampire image as an allegory for female sexual agency, self-determinism, and the ownership of Lewis's aforementioned street space, Lambert's choices may make more sense. The video is divided into performance scenes, with Harry singing and dancing on stage and scenes fleshing out a vague narrative. An experiencing music video, Vernalis describes a narrative continuum, with some videos, such as Aerosmith's Crazy, having a very clear storyline, others having no clear narrative, and most videos falling somewhere in the middle. I Want That Man falls more toward the clear narrative side, but the lack of a definitive plot marks it closer to the middle, as it's less a narrative and more a set of characters and events akin to episodic rather than plot-driven storytelling. Vernalis writes in Unruly Media that Alfred Hitchcock once quipped that film was life with all the boring bits cut out, and that some music videos seem, quote, like a feature with all of its boring bits cut out, unquote. This could be extended to say that the original edit of I Want That Man is even more briefly sketched, a short film with its boring bits cut out. What is present are characters and events. When Harry is not shown on stage, she is shown in one of several sets, the most frequent being what I have termed the crypt set, a large space with a raised box in the middle that can be read as either a coffin or a bed. Other sets are used more sparingly, including a balcony area where Harry meets up with the titular man, and an alley set where Harry hangs out with her band members. All of the sets, including the stage set, are awash in purple lighting, contrasting lights and darks, and the exterior sets are plunged into perpetual nighttime. In the video, the alley and crypt sets get considerable screen time, as does the presence of a young man whom Harry is pursuing. In several scenes, it is clear Harry's character is not only a singer performing at a concert in front of a sea of fans, but also a drifter and vampire, as evidenced by the clear presence of fangs and the frequent depiction of her biting her would-be lover on the neck. The presence of Harry's fangs, her depiction of waking from and going to sleep in a coffin-like structure, her clear interest in drinking blood, and her repeated removal of the crucifix from around the neck of her would-be lover all leave little doubt that her character, as well as those of several of her bandmates, are meant to be read as vampires. As discussed earlier, the female vampire can be seen as an object of unrepentant sexuality, particularly of a sort untethered from social mores, with the additional implication that Harry and her bandmates are either homeless or some sort of group of travelers. This edit of the video also gives us a sense of subversion of the street space as no longer being only a masculine domain but a feminine one as well, which is further supported by the fact that several of Harry's bandmates are also female. When combining this unapologetic occupation of a traditionally masculine space, the street/alley, with the identity of a sexually rapacious supernatural being, the vampire, the song's lyrics, speaking of greed and sexuality, combine to give us a reading of the piece as being a thinly unified story of a woman who is wholly other from hegemonic structures, not merely due to her gender, but her very species, sexuality, goals, and location. And as demonstrated in scenes showing her performing before a crowd of eager, enthusiastic fans, Harry's character is celebrated. Even the young man whom Harry pursues does not seem to mind her drinking his blood. He makes no attempt to remove himself from her clutches or to avoid her pursuit of him. The vampire elements in Goldfrapp's 2010 video Alive do not appear until nearly 3/4 of the way through the clip, but even prior to this reveal, the piece is surreal. In much more overt ways than I Want That Man, Alive is full of cultural allusions, mostly to other musicians, music videos, and music-based texts. Like I Want That Man, it is also an alternative dance pop song hovering around the 3 minutes. Alive is the second single from Goldfrapp's 2010 album Head First, and the video was directed by the production duo Legs Media, George Greville and Jeremy Jasper. Just prior to Alive, Greville and Jasper worked with Florence and the Machine on the video for Dog Days Are Over. Dog Days Are Over is an interesting precursor to Alive insofar as it also exhibits the traits of a performance clip within a patina of intertextual references floating atop it and functioning as a thin narrative. However, unlike the sequence of differentiating events occurring in Alive, Dog Days Are Over is more image-based and less clearly episodic. We merely observe a pastiche of varying multi- and pop-cultural references to things as disparate as kabuki theater, Georgian monks, 60s girl groups, Star Trek, Scottish warriors of the Middle Ages, gospel choirs, the French Revolution, and Grecian muses. This last is carried through into Alive, wherein Alison Goldfrapp is clothed in a tunic reminiscent of Grecian clothing broadly but muses, and the costume changes of Olivia Newton-John's muse character in the 1980 film Xanadu in particular. Newton-John's visual presence is everywhere in Alive, from Alison's positioning on the raised staircase over a group of dancers, visually quoting the title musical number from Xanadu, to the female aerobics dancers referencing the music video for Physical, and 1980s exercise videos generally. There are also visual allusions to the video for Bonnie Tyler's Total Eclipse of the Heart, and the styling of Alison Goldfrapp's clothing and hair, as well as several shots mimicking both Tyler's video and Xanadu. In terms of the episodic narrative, the video depicts Alison Goldfrapp as a leader of a group of men, all costumed as if members of the glam metal band Kiss, who stand in a space marked by a pentagram on the floor. The men begin to dance as Alison sings atop the staircase positioned above them, and 1 minute into the video, a group of female dancers joins the men. The women are dressed as if ready for a 1980s exercise video shoot, alluding to Physical. As they join in dancing with the men, the interactions between the two genders grow more sexually aggressive, with the men leering at the women and the women going from ignoring the attention to seeming to cultivate it. At just past the 2-minute mark, however, things take a surprising turn, with Alison appearing to activate the female dancers' vampiric identities via shooting a laser beam at them. Immediately, one of the women's eyes turns silver and fangs protrude from her mouth. The vampires then proceed to attack the men, their blood visible as multicolored glitter. Ultimately, Alison herself reveals a set of gleaming gold fangs before retreating to a neon-decorated coffin. The song's lyrics, written by Goldfrapp members Alison Goldfrapp and Will Gregory, describe a narrator waking up with the rising sun, being blinded by the light and feeling as if the sun resets her mind. The narrator goes on to describe how her lover makes her feel and she looks forward to spending a perfect night with them, one in which the sky is clear and the moon is full. Nothing in the lyrics speaks to a theme of vampirism except perhaps the image of the full moon, and indeed the narrator is capable of standing in broad sunlight. However, much like I Want That Man, the addition of vampire imagery to the video of Alive is not necessarily incompatible with some elements of the song's content. The tune is mostly in a major key and the tempo is fast-paced. As with Harry's song, the narrator of Alive is taking ownership of her relationship and speaking about her emotional state, not that of her lover's. The repeated refrain of "I'm feeling alive again," may indeed be the source of inspiration for the vampire imagery, as feeling alive is not necessarily the same as literally being alive. A vampire is traditionally a former human who has experienced clinical death as part of the transformation process, but afterward they are able to behave as if they were alive. Hence the common term undead for the state of being not quite deceased. Furthermore, the addition of the word again to this quality of feeling alive could imply a previous state of sadness prior to the narrator fighting her current lover, but might also indicate there was a point of more literal death. If the narrator's joy is reframed as a state of new rebirth following a transformation into a vampire, then the figure of the unnamed lover could instead or also be the vampire who turned her. Feelings of love and admiration for one's vampire progenitor or sire are seen in various iterations of Dracula, as well as the relationships between Drusilla, Spike, and Darla Angel in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, John Miriam and Miriam Sarah in The Hunger, and May Caleb in Near Dark. These relationships are all romantic and or sexual, in addition to being sire-progeny pairs. This could imply that Allison's character in Alive is the vampire sire of all the female dancers who then entice the men with seduction before attacking them. The feminist implications of the video are not subtle. The 5 women, led by a 6th, who is elevated above all of them, use femininely coded practices of ballet dance and aerobic-based fitness to seduce and kill a group of men who are coded as ultra-masculine in their dress and costuming. The men are aligned with forms of music and culture trending toward extreme posturing of masculinist ideology, heavy metal, and biker culture, while the woman's attack of them reveals their blood to run with glitter, which could either imply the men had an inner relationship to secretly feminine elements, or that the female vampires are able to turn blood into glitter, which codes their vampirism as making them even more highly feminine rather than being a quasi-masculine/monstrous trait, reducing their femininity. The men begin at various points to mimic the women's dance moves, marking a point in which the women's dance has begun to put the men into a thrall, a vampiric ability depicted in some media wherein vampires can hypnotize their victims. This thrall winds up forcing the men to perform specific ballet-related dance moves that would tend to seem incongruous with their previously depicted gender performance. By seeming to kill the men, the female vampires have symbolically neutralized a clique devoted to hyper or toxic masculinity, and they are able to do it through rituals associated with both extreme femininity and overt monstrosity. The purpose of the allusions to 70s and 80s popular culture, particularly in combination with the vampire storyline, is perhaps more difficult to parse, but I would argue it is an example of using intertextuality in combination with horror conventions to create a parodic text using the element of a plot twist to make a political statement. In her essay on Michael Jackson's Thriller, Kobana Mercer describes how the use of 1950s style of horror film conventions creates a camp sensibility, speaking to the video's subversive commentary on gender and sexuality. And Goodwin discusses at length how parody, pastiche, and homage can be combined in videos to create a social criticism, resulting in the generation of a range of readings in any particular video. Layering meanings and creating opportunities for audience surprise encourages multiple viewings. In the case of Alive, viewers are initially presented with a work of utilizing homage in ways quite similar to Goldfrapp's video Oh La La, which alludes to 1970s variety television shows. Unlike that earlier piece, Alive takes a turn and switches its genre. Viewers are no longer working on the level of direct homage, but instead a subversion of it, similar to the subtle changes Madonna and Mary Lambert made when using Marilyn Monroe's performance of Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend as the jumping-off point for Material Girl. Instead of giving an identical performance, Madonna subverts it to create a subtly more feminist text. Similarly, Goldfrapp is not giving us a composite of Olivia Newton-John works with elements of other early 1980s videos and cultural signifiers, but instead using that as a starting off point to layer in a secondary set of images, the vampire storyline, that also creates a more feminist text. In a way, there are influences of second, third, and even fourth wave feminism through the differences between I Want That Man and Alive. The former video is caught between the end of the second and beginning of third wave feminism, a liminal space wherein women's liberation hinged on establishing workplace egalitarianism and neoliberal rights for women married, and Harry's narrator requesting material goods alongside sexual pleasure. The second wave sought birth control, an end to workplace discrimination, dismantling of beauty standards, and a lessened focus on marriage and motherhood. Feminism's third wave, by contrast, established itself as a sex-positive and more inclusive space with political goals focusing on how to reduce sexual violence while simultaneously calling for even more sexual autonomy and being more receptive to issues of intersectionality. The Goldfrapp video was released at the transition of the third wave into something even further beyond it, a way of adding digital media activism and literacy to its arsenal, as well as an even greater focus on transnational and LGBTQ+ issues. Tellingly, however, both of the videos under consideration are overwhelmingly white in their performer composition, musicians and actors/dancers/models alike. And although both Harry and Alison Goldfrapp identify as bisexual, LGBT LGBTQ+ issues are not addressed in either piece. The romantic pairings are decidedly heterosexual in nature. Alive does exhibit the third wave tendency to focus a lot of attention on media images of women via its more obvious use of illusions and parody, but I Want That Man's message of greater sex positivity positions it closer to the 1990s movement than the 70s and 80s. However, the ability of Alive to be more explicit in many ways in its overt and uncensored depiction of female vampirism and its allegory of patriarchal dismantling speaks to the strides in feminist media made in the 2 decades between the video's releases. The message of Alive is also an interestingly collective rather than personal feminism. Viewers do not have one female vampire pursuing a feminist agenda, as is seen in I Want That Man. Even that video's title asserts a solo pursuit of one woman's goals. In Alive, it is a coven of women who take down a masculine presence, speaking to a fourth wave focus on collective activism and solidarity. Imagery that has become a trope through repetition in multiple popular culture products can be a way to ground a work in a specific genre, mood, theme, or narrative structure. Subverting that imagery in some way through combining it with other illusions or breaks in the expected narrative, either by casting unexpected figures as certain stock character types or creating genre mashups, can be effective at challenging audiences to consider difficult ideas in new ways. When a work can be read through a lens of feminist or intersectional identity-based theory, and also uses familiar imagery in destabilizing ways, that piece may merit examination both within the context of its original period of production, as well as in conversation with subsequent pieces taking similar ideas into a new direction. In examining the use of vampires in these 2 music videos, it becomes clear that the vampire image is one that can still garner interesting fruits from analysis, and that music video itself is a medium that remains difficult to discuss due to its evolving form in screening venues. For decades, women in music video were used as props. Models posed on car hoods and strutted in stilettos while male musicians performed, the camera assuming a default male gaze and masculine address. However, even early videos by female musicians and directors demonstrate an attempt to push back against this trend, creating opportunities for feminist ideologies to emerge and challenging hegemonic ideas both within the genre itself and society at large. As Lisa A. Lewis writes, quote, "When female musicians are allowed the credibility of speaking for an audience, particularly for girls and women, gender inequality is fundamentally threatened," unquote. Cool. Dracula's Daughter is the female vampire on film. I have not seen either of those music videos. Sorry, Debbie Harry. Almost as long as cinema has existed, vampires have appeared on screen, symbolizing an unholy union between sex and death. The vampire, male or female, has represented the libido, a repressed force that consumed its victims. Early iconic representations of male vampires were seen in Nosferatu and Dracula, but not until Dracula's Daughter in 1936 did a female sex vampire assume the lead. Other female vampires followed, perhaps most provocatively in the Hammer films of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Later incarnations in such films as Near Dark and From Dusk Till Dawn offered modern takes on this now iconic figure. In Dracula's Daughters, the female vampire on film, Douglas Brode and Leah Deinecke, have assembled a varied collection of essays that explore the cinematic type that simultaneously frightens and seduces viewers. These essays address a number of issues raised by the female vampire film, such as violence perpetrated on and by women, reactions to the genre from feminists, anti-feminists, and post-feminists, the implications of female vampire films for audiences both gay and straight, and how films reflect the period during which they were created. Other topics include female vampire films in relationship to vampire fiction, particularly by women such as Anne Rice, the relationship of the vampire myth to sexually transmitted diseases like AIDS, issues of race and misogyny, and the unique phenomena of teen vampires in young adult books and films such as Twilight. Featuring more than 30 photos spanning several decades, this collection offers a compelling assessment of an archetypal figure, an enduring representation of dark desires that continues to captivate audiences. This book will appeal not only to scholars and students, but also to any lover of transgressive cinema. Published in 2013. Sounds cool, actually. Dracula's Daughters. Well. Okay, well, hopefully this week I'm going to make time to actually go through this book again so that we can properly rank it next week. And then after that, we can start our newest book, which is, I don't have it around me, so I can't tell you what the title is, but it is a vampire short story book. It's smaller than the last one we read and definitely smaller than the first one that we read. We'll probably get through it quickly. I'll have to go hunting in my used bookstore for what to read after this. If you made it all the way to the end of this stream, thank you so much. You're a dork and a nerd, but so am I. Thanks for being in my book club. I appreciate it. I will be back next week. Oh, my throat hurts. I will be back next week on Sunday, 6:00 p.m., as long as I'm not late. Sorry about that. See you then. And I will have a new video out in March that is about the Sonya Blue, the first 2 books in the Sonya Blue series. So if you're hoping for new videos from me, look out for that. I will be done with it soon, hopefully. Okay. Thank you. Welcome to the book club. Goodbye and good night.